Okay, set up another page. We're going to finish B12D, and it's going to take a whole entire page, so don't try and fit it on the last half of that. So set up a page in your biology spiral, and if you don't have a biology spiral yet, why don't you? There's going to come a time in about a week or two where I'm going to say take a picture of your notes and send them in to me, and that's going to be for a grade, so be prepared for that. And by the way, do your work. So B12D described the flow of matter through the carbon and nitrogen cycles and explain the consequences of disrupting these cycles. So we're going to start with the nitrogen cycle. The nitrogen cycle, again, it's more of a gaseous cycle. I'm going to always pause this if you need to. So I'm going to move this down just a little bit to here. The nitrogen in the atmosphere. Okay, so we require nitrogen in our bodies. But as animals, we can't breathe in the nitrogen to get it. And if you recall, 70% of our atmosphere is nitrogen. We just breathe it in and blow it back out. In order to get usable nitrogen for us, we have to eat it. It has to be in solid form, some type of nitrogen compound. Now, nitrogen normally is a gas, so you can't just say, oh, well, I'll freeze it and eat it that way. First of all, that'd be really, really cold and a bad idea. Second of all, again, we get our nitrogen in a compound of some form, usually a nitrate or a nitrite compound of some kind. So that whole process starts with nitrogen in the atmosphere, and it's fixed, and that's the proper way, that's the science term for it, in the usable form into a solid compound form by these bacteria called nitrogen-fixing bacteria. So what they do is they can take the gaseous nitrogen into their bodies, and they have a chemical reaction running, and it forms into some solid nitrogen compound. So it's not pure nitrogen gas anymore. It's usually a nitrate or a nitrite compound. So right down here it says nitrates right here. Letter B, now a lot of these bacteria, nitrogen-fixing bacteria, are on the roots of plants like legumes like peanuts, and they'll have little nodes on their roots, and they have bacteria in them. And the bacteria actively do that with the nitrogen in the air. They take the nitrogen gas out of the air, and yes, there's still air down in the soil. The air, if you guys have ever paid attention to having a good a farmer around or someone who likes a nice lawn, they talk about aerating their lawn. There's still air down in the soil. You think about animals that are in the dirt, they still have to breathe, don't they? So you have to have air down there. So plants use it then to make the body parts. So you've got these nitrogen-fixing bacteria that are associated with the plants, and one of their byproducts is this nitrate, or a solid form of the nitrogen compound, and the plants use that. So they're in a symbiotic relationship in that sense. So the plants get something beneficial from the bacteria that are in the roots with it. So they use it to make their own body parts. Specifically, things like protein. Proteins require nitrogen, so does DNA requires nitrogen. If you vaguely remember the structure of protein from your 8th grade biology class, it's made of nitrogenous bases, the A's, G's, C's, and T's, the letters that make up the ladder of the DNA. Once the plants have used it to make their body parts, quote unquote, then we know that herbivores are going to eat those, right? Think cow. Think animals eating the plants here. They're going to eat those plants, and that's how we get the nitrogen compounds to make the body parts. It's no longer a gaseous nitrogen. It's actually a nitrate in a solid compound. Nitrate is an NO3. It's nitrogen and oxygen bonded together with something else. So it's included with something else there. So the herbivores eat the plants. So where did the plants get it? They got it from the nitrogen-fixing bacteria, which got it from the air. The carnivores, of course, then eat the herbivores, and they get the nitrogen compounds in their bodies to make body parts. And at any time, any of these animals are going to release wastes, and that's going to put it back in here. So this next piece right down here, wastes are decomposed. Here's what it is. Urine, feces, all of those things. If you think about urine, you can even smell some of the ammonia that's in the urine, and ammonia is NH3. There's the nitrogen right here. So either wastes are going to be put out, or the animal or organism dies, and you're going to release that nitrogen back into the air, mostly as NH3, ammonia. And guess what? There's some other bacteria that breaks down that ammonia into the nitrogen gas and some other things. So again, here's where we start having the cycle. It goes back into the atmosphere, and here again, we have it cycle. So again, we have this nitrogen cycle, and it's a gaseous cycle again, where it starts in the atmosphere with gaseous nitrogen, it gets in a solid form in all the organisms, and then ultimately, through decomposition, we're going to put it back into the gaseous form inside the atmosphere. Similar to the carbon cycle in some senses, because we start out with the carbon in a gaseous form, although it's not pure carbon, it's carbon dioxide, and we start out with a gaseous form for the nitrogen, and that happens to be a pure compound. You guys all know that nitrogen is a gas. You should all know that carbon is a solid. We call it pencil lead, but all of your pencils, that's not lead anymore, that's carbon. So you should know that that carbon is a solid form. We also have the nitrogen sink, and in this case, the huge main bulk of the nitrogen on our planet is in the atmosphere. That is the sink, or the reservoir for our nitrogen. But again, our TEK doesn't stop there. It says you're going to describe the flow of matter through the carbon and nitrogen cycles, and explain the consequences of disrupting the cycles. Okay, so what happens when something in here overloads? What happens when, instead of going through this nice procedure over and over again, it spits out somewhere else where it's not supposed to be? So here's what we're going to talk about next. We're going to talk about disrupting the cycles. And remember, you need to pause this whenever necessary so you can get this stuff down here. So I'm going to put it in kind of like a little chart here. And I'm going to start with nitrogen on the left, carbon on the right, and these will be the causes. What causes the disruption? What's going on that's going to mess up the nice, pretty cycle that we have going on here? So let's look at the nitrogen cycle first. And this is a big one over here. I'm going to ignore this side right over here. The big deal right here is organic waste dumping in water. So we humans have a lot of waste products that we deal with, and we put them in our toilets and we flush them. Well, where does it go from there? Does it just go straight into the rivers? No, because that would really, really totally screw up the cycles here. What we do is we have a water treatment plant, and we help break down all the chemicals that are in there so they're healthy for us then to dump into our water systems. If we were to dump all that raw sewage straight into the water system, that would completely mess things up. You'd have all this, you guys all know that sewage can be fertilizer for things, and so it would make this huge bloom of all these plants that would choke out all the animals. It'd be a real mess. Organic waste dumping in water. If you live or have know what I'm talking about when I talk about the feedlots, they have to deal with a lot of waste products that they have to be careful about where they're dumping those waste products. Feedlots, they again do lots and lots and lots of waste that they have to deal with. They can't just dump it into the water system. Fertilizer runoff. We have a lot of crops planted around in Carson County and in Hutchinson County. We have lots and lots of farmland, and we have to make sure again that when we dump fertilizer on this, that we don't have a lot of runoff into rivers and streams. We don't want, first of all, it's expensive if we let the fertilizer run off. Second of all, it really damages and does causes some issues with the nitrogen cycle. And then pollution. We have a lot of factories that put out some type of nitrate gas, and if you get a nitrate gas or nitrite gas like NO2 or NO3, and we have it off in air, that it's just okay, so nitrogen dioxide or nitrogen trioxide, we put that into the air. When it rains, what that does is form some type of acid like HNO3 or HNO2 forms like that, and so you have acid rain that forms from that. So these are causes. These are things that could cause the issues here. Over on the carbon side, two big things that we have that we deal with is one, deforestation, because remember, all that carbon, a lot of the carbon is in a reservoir in the forest. So what that would do is it would release a lot of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere at one time. And then we also have burning fossil fuels, and you know, if you plan on someday having a car, you're going to be burning those fossil fuels. These two things change the balance of the cycles, just like these things over here. We have these nitrogen cycles and these carbon cycles, and they're in you can think of it as homeostasis. They're in a balance. So everything is a cycle and it's a balance. When you do something that messes up the balance, it's going to have an impact on our environment in this sense. So what kind of effect, what kind of impact are we talking about? If we're talking carbon, if we mess up the carbon cycle, then obviously, and you guys have heard of this, we talk about the greenhouse effect. And when I say greenhouse effect, what that means is that if you set up a greenhouse, you want it nice and warm and kind of humid in there. That's what's great for the plants to grow in. And so when we increase the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, it heats things up and keeps the moisture in. And so we talk about, climate change and how things might possibly heat up due to that. And that's because of these things going on up here. If we talk about the nitrogen cycle, it's a little bit different, not quite so obvious here. The first word that I have here is eutrophication. Eutrophication means that you dump this nutrient. Okay, so remember the waste products and ammonia and all that stuff, they're fertilizers. You dump this nutrient-rich stuff into soils, into water especially, and what happens is that the plant population in the water, any type of water, they're most susceptible to this, is going to increase. That's not so bad. Some fish, aquatic animals prefer open areas, some prefer planted areas, but you're thinking, okay, that's not that bad. The difficulty comes, or the issues come, when those plants die. Think about around here, the weather gets too cold and you're going to have a lot of those plants that die off in the pond. And when they die, they're going to decay and they're going to release lots of carbon dioxide. The carbon dioxide, when it's in water, produces an acid. So by doing this, you set up a series of steps that actually acidifies the water. So I'm going to cover this up a second right over here. So when these plants die, they release this carbon dioxide gas that forms carbonic acid in water, and it increases the pH. I can't believe I wrote that. It decreases the pH. Sheesh. It decreases the pH. Let's put this arrow down, which makes it more acidic. There. So when it makes it more acidic, that's really negative on the animal life. So ultimately, by dumping all this nitrogen stuff in the water, yeah, you do great things for the plants, but then when the plants die off, it kills a lot of the animals over here. The other two things I have are acid rain, which we just talked about, and algae bloom. We don't live by the ocean around here, so we're not as familiar with these things, but algae bloom would be something like there are a lot of algae that are toxic. They produce toxic chemicals, and when you have them in low amounts, it's not that big a deal. But at certain times during the season, they naturally flourish and they have these big booms in population. They call it an algae bloom. There are some places that they talk about if you catch crabs or something like that, then don't eat them in the month that has an R in it. So like April, if you caught some during April, you wouldn't eat those. And it's usually associated with how much algae is in the water and what kinds of poisons are in the systems there. So you have all of these things that are effects of messing up these two cycles, the carbon cycle and the nitrogen cycle.